She wasn't supposed to notice me. I was just her son's roommate, another name on her rent list. But that night, when she said, "Pay in person," I realized she wasn't asking for money, she was testing how long I could pretend I didn't feel the same thing she did. When I moved in with Ryan, it wasn't supposed to be anything more than a practical decision. Split rent, shared groceries, two friends trying to make life a little easier. He'd mentioned that his mom owned the house but mostly stayed busy with work. I didn't think much of it, until I met her. Elena. She opened the front door that first evening with a calm that made everything else around her feel quieter. Mid to late 30s, poised but warm, she had that rare presence that didn't need to demand attention, it simply drew it. Her hair was loosely tied, a few strands brushing across her cheek, and her eyes carried the kind of tired kindness that made you wonder what stories she'd lived through. "Welcome," she said, her voice low, unhurried. "Ryan said you're taking the guest room. You'll find extra sheets in the closet." That was it. No forced smiles, no overextended politeness. Just quiet composure. For the first few days, she barely seemed to exist. I'd hear the faint sound of her footsteps early in the morning, the smell of coffee drifting down the hall, and sometimes soft music playing from her room, old jazz, smooth and melancholic. She always left before I did, returning late, usually carrying files or her laptop. But the small things caught me off guard. Once, when I skipped breakfast to rush for work, she appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a plate of toast and a mug of tea. "You shouldn't start your day empty," she said without looking directly at me. Her tone wasn't motherly, it was matter-of-fact, but somehow it felt personal. I mumbled thanks, and she just nodded, walking away as if the moment never happened. Those little gestures repeated in quiet rhythm, the kind that meant nothing, yet somehow started to mean everything. On weekends, when Ryan was out, I'd sometimes find her sitting in the garden, tending to the plants. I'd greet her in passing, and she'd look up with a faint smile, one that never quite reached her eyes but still managed to linger in my thoughts longer than I cared to admit. There was no obvious tension, just awareness. The way she'd glance up when I entered a room, the way I found myself lowering my voice when speaking to her, afraid to disturb the calm she carried. At night, I'd hear the faint creak of floorboards when she walked to the kitchen for tea. Once, our paths crossed there, both of us half awake, both too polite to make small talk. I remember the steam rising from her cup, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and the way her eyes softened when she said, "You should try chamomile. Helps with restless thoughts." It was such an ordinary thing to say, and yet, something inside me shifted. Looking back, that's how it started. Not with a spark or a stare, but with a quiet rhythm, the soft pulse of two lives slowly, unknowingly sinking to the same silence. It's strange how something can change without anyone saying a word. Ryan started spending more time out, late nights, work trips, new friends, and without realizing it, I began sharing the house with his mother more than with him. The place felt different when it was just the two of us. Quieter. Still, but not empty. I'd come home from work and find Elena in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, cooking with a kind of patience I wasn't used to seeing. She moved gracefully, as if every motion had its place, the sound of the knife against the board, the faint clink of a spoon stirring something warm. I'd offer to help, but she'd just shake her head with a small smile. "You'll ruin the recipe," she'd tease lightly, though the warmth behind it told me she didn't really mind the company. Sometimes, she'd sit across from me at the dining table, both of us eating quietly. She'd ask about my work, my plans, what I wanted from life, not out of curiosity, but genuine interest. The way she listened made me speak slower, think deeper. It was rare, being heard like that. One evening, the power went out. Ryan wasn't home, so Elena brought candles into the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, soft candlelight flickering between us. The room smelled faintly of vanilla from the wax, and the shadows painted gentle lines across her face. She talked about how quiet the house used to be after her divorce, how she'd forgotten what it was like to have company again. I listened, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked questions, just to hear her talk a little longer. She laughed once, a real, unguarded laugh, and it stayed with me for days after. From that night, something shifted, subtle, but real. We started crossing paths more often. She'd linger in the kitchen while I made coffee, asking if I wanted to try the blend she liked. Sometimes she'd bring tea to my desk when I worked late. Her presence became part of my days, small, quiet, but constant. And it wasn't just me. I could feel that she noticed, too. The way her gaze lingered a second longer when I spoke. The faint pause in her voice before saying goodnight. The gentle touch when passing a cup, her fingers brushing mine, accidental, maybe, but not entirely unintentional. One evening, after dinner, she joined me on the porch. The night air was cool, and the street was almost silent. She sat close enough for our shoulders to almost touch. We didn't talk much, just listened to the faint sound of crickets, the occasional car passing by. Then she said softly, "You remind me a little of how I used to be, before I learned to keep things to myself." There was no follow-up, no explanation. Just her voice, quiet and honest, carrying something deeper than the words themselves. That night, when she stood to leave, her hand brushed my arm. Not a lingering touch, just enough to leave a trace of warmth long after she was gone. And that's when I knew. Whatever was growing between us wasn't imagined. It was real, delicate, unspoken, and quietly dangerous. I'd been so caught up in work that the rent completely slipped my mind. It wasn't unusual for Ryan's mom to handle it directly, she liked things orderly, predictable. But when my phone buzzed that evening, the message was shorter than usual. "You're late on rent. Pay in person tonight." Just that. No emoji, no punctuation beyond the period. I stared at it longer than I should have. Maybe it was the timing, maybe it was her tone, firm, but somehow, personal. By the time I reached her door, the house was quiet. Ryan wasn't home. A soft light glowed beneath her door, and for a moment, I almost turned back. But before I could, her voice came through. "Come in." She sat by her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, a glass of wine half finished beside her. Papers were scattered neatly, organized chaos. When she looked up, her expression softened just slightly. "You didn't have to come this late," she said, but her voice didn't sound like she meant it. I handed her the envelope with the rent. She set it aside without checking. "Sit," she said quietly. "You look exhausted." It wasn't a question, and somehow I obeyed. She poured another glass of wine and slid it toward me. The air in the room felt warmer than it should have, not because of anything happening, but because of everything that wasn't. The silence stretched, comfortable but charged. We talked, at first about work, then about the house, then about the small things that fill silence when neither person wants the moment to end. She told me she missed noise, that the house had felt too still since Ryan grew up. "You get used to quiet," she said, looking at her hands. "But it's not the same as peace." Her words lingered in the air. I wanted to tell her I understood, that I'd been living in a quiet of my own, one filled with what-ifs and unspoken things. But I didn't know how to say that without revealing too much. At one point, she stood and walked to the bookshelf behind me, reaching for something. Her arm brushed my shoulder lightly, barely a touch, but it was enough to send a ripple through me. I could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something soft and clean. When she sat back down, she smiled, just a small, tired curve of her lips. "You remind me of a younger version of myself," she said softly. "Trying to stay strong even when life keeps asking for more." I laughed quietly, unsure what to do with the weight of her honesty. She handed me a small paper receipt, her fingers grazing mine as she did. This time, neither of us pulled away. For a moment, we just sat there, fingers still touching, both pretending not to notice. Her eyes met mine, calm, but with something unguarded flickering beneath. When I finally stood to leave, she said, almost under her breath, "Thank you, for not treating me like I'm just someone's mother." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Because for the first time, I realized, she wasn't. Not to me. After that night, something invisible changed between us. It wasn't dramatic, no confessions, no accidental closeness beyond what had already happened, yet every glance, every word carried a new weight. The air itself felt different, as if the house had begun to listen to us. The next morning, she greeted me the same way she always did, calm, polite, a soft smile that gave nothing away. But I noticed the pause in her eyes, the fraction of a second longer she looked at me before turning back to her coffee. I pretended not to notice, though my heart knew better. We didn't talk about what had happened. But we both remembered. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm, each moment laced with something unspoken. I found myself anticipating the sound of her voice in the morning, the soft click of her heels on the wooden floor, the faint citrus scent she left behind in the hallway. It was ridiculous, she was my friend's mother, a line I never meant to even approach. But the line had already blurred the night she handed me that receipt and held my gaze for too long. One evening, it started to rain, hard, relentless, with thunder echoing through the house. Ryan was gone for the weekend, and the sound of the storm made everything feel closer than it should have. I was in my room, reading, when a soft knock came on the door. When I opened it, Elena stood there, holding a folded towel. Her hair was damp, a few strands stuck to her forehead, and she smiled faintly. "You left this in the dryer," she said. I took it from her, brushing her hand accidentally, or maybe not. Our fingers lingered, the way they had before, that quiet spark returning. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was heavy with something neither could name. "You should close your window," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "Rain's coming in." She turned to leave, but I stopped her, not with words, just a look. She hesitated in the doorway, eyes meeting mine with that same fragile uncertainty that had been growing between us. The silence stretched, filled with the sound of rain tapping against the glass. She took a slow breath, then smiled faintly, as if reminding herself who she was, and who I wasn't supposed to be to her. "Good night," she whispered, her tone almost tender. "Good night," I echoed. When she left, the scent of her perfume stayed in the room, light, floral, mixed with the faintest trace of rain. I sat there for a long time, towel still in my hand, heart refusing to settle. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her footsteps down the hall, faint, careful, like she was pacing, or maybe like she was standing outside my door, wondering the same thing I was: how did something so innocent become so impossible to ignore? The days after the storm felt different, heavier somehow. Neither of us mentioned that night in the hallway, but it lingered like an unfinished sentence. Every small exchange carried a quiet hesitation now. A glance held too long, a smile that trembled at the edges. I tried to keep things normal, but normal had changed. When we spoke, I noticed how her voice softened when saying my name. When she laughed, her eyes flickered toward me before quickly looking away. She was careful, too careful, and that only made me notice her more. One evening, I found her sitting alone on the porch. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and soft. She was barefoot, her coffee cup resting beside her, eyes distant as if lost in some quiet thought. I hesitated at the doorway, but she noticed me and smiled faintly. "Ryan's staying over with friends tonight," she said, her tone casual but weighted. "You can join me if you want." I did. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sky fade from orange to blue. The sound of the wind brushed through the trees, the kind that makes you feel like the world has slowed down just for that moment. Then, quietly, she said, "You're easy to be around." It wasn't flirtation, not the way most people mean it. It sounded more like a truth she didn't intend to speak aloud. I smiled, unsure how to answer. "That's a good thing, right?" Her eyes met mine, calm but searching. It is. But it's also dangerous. She turned away then, as if regretting the words. I didn't push her to explain. We sat for a long time without speaking, just the sound of the evening around us, the faint hum of crickets, the creak of the porch wood beneath our feet. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. I know this is wrong, she said, staring at her hands. But it's harder to ignore you than it should be. My chest tightened. I hadn't realized how badly I'd needed to hear her say it, not because I wanted her to cross the line, but because it meant I wasn't imagining the pull between us. I looked at her then, really looked, at the way the fading light touched her hair, the calm strength in her face, the quiet vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. You don't have to pretend it's just you, I said softly. I feel it too. She exhaled slowly, almost in relief, but there was sadness in her eyes. Then we're both in trouble, she murmured with a small, trembling smile. Neither of us moved closer. There was no touch, no kiss, just silence. A heavy, aching silence that said everything words couldn't. When she finally stood, her hand brushed my shoulder. Good night, she whispered, voice low and unsteady. As she walked away, I sat there with the sound of her footsteps fading into the house, and for the first time, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like longing wrapped in restraint. When Ryan came back that weekend, the air inside the house felt strange, like two people were holding their breath while pretending nothing had changed. Elena and I both moved carefully, polite and distant, each gesture measured to erase what had been quietly spoken on the porch. She avoided looking at me for more than a few seconds at a time. Her tone was light, casual, but it carried that careful distance you use when you're afraid to feel too much. I tried to do the same. But pretending was harder than I expected. Every time she laughed at something Ryan said, I felt that quiet ache, not jealousy, but the memory of what her laughter had sounded like when it was just for me. For a while, we managed. Days passed in a kind of emotional truce. We didn't talk about the night she confessed, or the way I'd answered. But silence has a way of growing heavy when two people care too much. It was late one evening when she finally came to find me. I was sitting outside again, same porch, same quiet. The air was still warm from the day, and the cicadas hummed softly in the trees. She stepped out slowly, barefoot, her robe tied loosely around her waist. For a moment, she didn't say anything, just stood there, looking out into the dark. Then, softly, she said, "You should move out." The words hit harder than I expected. I looked at her, searching her face for something, a hint of hesitation, a crack in her calm, but her expression was steady. Only her eyes betrayed her, shining faintly in the porch light. I thought maybe I'd done something wrong, I said quietly. She shook her head. You didn't. That's the problem. She sat beside me then, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. If you stay, she said, this will turn into something neither of us can walk away from. And I don't want you to lose your friend. Or your peace. Her voice trembled slightly at the end, and I realized how much it was costing her to say those words. I don't want to leave, I admitted. But I don't want to make things harder for you either. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. You already make things hard for me, she said, a whisper of humor in her tone, and then her voice broke, softer now. But you also make me remember what it's like to feel alive. We sat there in silence, the space between us alive with everything unspoken. I wanted to reach out, to tell her that what we felt wasn't wrong, it was human. But the look in her eyes stopped me. It wasn't rejection. It was love wrapped in restraint. When she finally reached out and touched my cheek, it wasn't a goodbye, it was gratitude, and sorrow, and every emotion we'd both tried to bury. Be kind to yourself, she whispered. Don't let this be the thing that makes you colder. I nodded, unable to speak. When she stood and walked back inside, I stayed there for a long time, staring into the night, knowing that for once, love had asked for sacrifice instead of surrender. The week before I moved out passed in slow motion. Every moment in that house felt like a farewell disguised as routine: breakfast in silence, the faint sound of her footsteps upstairs, the way her voice softened whenever she said my name. Ryan helped me pack, joking about how quickly I'd be back once I realized how expensive living alone was. I laughed along, but every word felt heavy. He didn't notice the quiet glances Elena and I exchanged, brief, cautious, filled with everything we couldn't say. The night before I left, I found her in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. She didn't turn when I entered. The light above the sink cast a soft glow over her shoulders, her hair loosely tied, a few strands falling along her neck. "You don't have to do this alone," she said quietly, her back still turned. I leaned against the counter. "You asked me to." She set the plate down carefully, took a deep breath, then faced me. Her eyes were calm, but there was a fragility in them that hadn't been there before. "I know what I asked," she said. "But that doesn't mean it's easy to watch you go." For a moment, neither of us moved. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space between us. I wanted to say something, to tell her that she wasn't just another chapter in my life, that she'd changed how I saw everything, but the words felt too small. Instead, I said, "You made this place feel like home." Her expression faltered then, just slightly. "It's still your home," she whispered. "Even if you're not here." That broke me more than I expected. When I left the kitchen, she didn't follow. But later that night, I found a folded note on my desk. No signature, no greeting, just a few words written in her elegant, slanted handwriting. "Some people pass through your life quietly, but they never really leave." I read it over and over until the ink blurred in my vision. The next morning came too quickly. The house smelled of rain again, the kind of cool, clean air that carries memories with it. Ryan was loading boxes into my car, humming along to the radio, while I went to find her one last time. She was in the garden, watering the plants. The morning sun caught in her hair, turning it gold at the edges. For a moment, I just stood there, memorizing the scene, the soft rustle of leaves, the way her hands moved gently through the stems. When she finally noticed me, she smiled faintly. "All packed?" "Yeah," I said, my voice rougher than I wanted it to be. "Just wanted to say goodbye." She nodded, setting the watering can aside. Goodbyes are easier when you don't make them long. Still, she stepped closer, close enough that I could see the fine lines near her eyes, the quiet sadness that came with them. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "And don't forget to eat breakfast." I smiled. "I won't." For a second, it felt like the world held its breath. Then she reached out, just a touch, her fingers brushing my sleeve, and whispered, "Be happy." As I walked away, I didn't look back. But in the reflection of the car window, I saw her still standing there, sunlight catching the faintest smile on her lips, the kind that says, "Some debts aren't meant to be paid, only remembered." If this story touched you, if you've ever felt that quiet pull towards someone you weren't supposed to fall for, then you know what it means to love in silence. And if you felt it too, like, comment, and subscribe for more stories where love whispers louder than words.